Good evening and welcome to the Board of Selectmen's meeting on Monday, February 6th, 2023. A call to order at 6:01 p.m. Beth, can we have a roll call, please?
Select Chair, Mr. DeRoche.
Here.
Select Vice Chair, Mr. Coy.
Here.
Selectman, Mr. Britton.
Here.
Select Mr. Gifford.
Here.
We have Town Manager, Mr. Colby here. We also have several folks from the EPA. If they would like to introduce themselves, I would appreciate it.
Cheryl Sprague, EPA Project Manager.
Steph Monette from New Hampshire DES.
And I'm Kelsey Dunville with the EPA. I work in our Community Involvement and Public Affairs office.
Thank you. All right, and let's all stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Next on our agenda is we have public comment. Is there anyone here from the public wishing to comment on anything? Okay, there being none, I'll move on to our first agenda item of the evening. We have the folks from the EPA and New Hampshire DES here to give us an update regarding the BD waste oil site cleanup. So I'll hand it over to Cheryl Sprague from the EPA, who's the lead project manager, to give us a presentation. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Great, thanks you, Jay. So my name is Cheryl Sprague. I'm the EPA Remedial Project Manager, and I have been since about 2013 for the site. And with me, as we've introduced, is Stephanie.
Yep, I'm the project manager for the state of New Hampshire, Department of Environmental Services, and I've been on this site for 3 years.
Right, and Kelsey, as we introduced with Community Relations, she's fairly new to the site, but we're very excited to have her. She has a lot of experience. So thank you for inviting us here tonight. Just to recap, so the BD site group and EPA came here, and we came here back in September. We gave a small presentation on the wrap-up of some of the work we were doing, and it included some information on a 5-year review, which is a report EPA does every 5 years to evaluate the protectiveness of the remedy. Is it still protective? Is there anything that needs to be done? Jay had asked us to come back and maybe give a little more update on the 5-year review, and as part of that, because of the original remedy was written in 2004 and a lot of the work was done before that, to kind of recap how we come up with a remedy. What is the process of looking at contaminants in soils? What is the process of developing the risk assessment? How do you get to this remedy and get to the cleanup? So I know you've had multiple presentations already about how great the cleanup has been, so I'm not going to go into those details in this presentation. It's more about this process, how we look at it, and how it impacts how we look at what needs to be done in the 5-year review. All right. So this is, the site history. So the site started operations in 1920s. It was mainly a petroleum and waste storage and oil handling processes. There's also a second part of parcel 2, which I'll show you in a second. And the reason why I wanted to show you this is not because it's just nice to see historical pictures, but it's great in understanding why we are looking at the site and what the contaminants are and where the risks are. There's lots of actions at the site that happened in the early days. And you can see there's the original buildings, the secondary building, lots of containment. These were a lot of the petroleum and waste storage, and they sat on the ground. There's a great picture of just telling you the size of it. And that gives you an idea of what the volume was that may have been brought to the site or stored at the site. So I just wanted to, I wanted to point out one more thing. So this area right here, this is an area, you can't see it any longer. It's covered over. This is where the lagoon is. This is where oils were dumped into about a 1-acre pit in the ground. This is the above ground storage tank, the old building. This is the underground storage tank that was no longer there after the site. So you can't see some of these things. And these are miscellaneous soil piles. At the end of their process, they brought in a lot of excavated materials from underground storage tanks, from gas stations, to bring them in and try to do asphalt. So that's what those soil piles are from. And when you look at the overall site plan, what we just showed you sits right here on what we call parcel 1. It's roughly about 20 acres, and it includes it. So parcel 2 is where the sand and gravel operations are. And that currently houses the management and migration of the groundwater remedy that you've heard a lot about. In order for this groundwater remedy to be implemented in the construction of this water treatment plant, there was also this long driveway here that came into the site. So a new set of lights was put in here by the BD site group, and the soils were excavated and cleaned in this area to get down here so that the system could be installed. So most of the discussion I'm going to talk about tonight are the main areas of source. So we have the lagoon area that sits here, where a lot of the petroleum and the us were there, and then the phase 2 area, which again is a former landfill. There was a lot of releases to the ground here. We had the underground storage tank, and a lot of the oil residuals were in this area. Just to get you to see the site plan. So this is a conceptual site model. This has been presented before at the site. So essentially it shows you that you have all these sources, right? So we have the lagoon area where it was released, the above ground storage tanks, underground storage tanks, the on-site landfill, and then miscellaneous storage that would have been along these areas. And the materials are stored on the site, and if they leak, if they spill, they're poured on the ground, they're going to infiltrate through the soils down until they get down to the water table. Now, because these are mostly oils, kerosene, diesel, gasoline, they're going to want to hit the water table, and because they're lighter than the water, they're going to sit on top of this water table. So what happens is everything infiltrates down, and we get this is called LNAPL, and it stands for light non-aqueous phase liquid. So what it means is basically oil on water. It doesn't want to mix, it wants to sit on top. And that oil then, because the water table, depending on the season, goes down and goes back up, you end up with this thing called a smear zone. And that's where that oil gets entrained into the soil, both above and below the water table, as that water table moves. And then as these materials are sitting here, this material is a combination. So you've got oils, you've got solvents, everything mixed together, and these contaminants can leach out of this area and get into the groundwater. And then that groundwater can then migrate to where it wants to go, which could be to Kelly Brook at this site, or down gradient towards the off Parcel 2 into the residential area.
Jay, can I ask a question as we go along?
Yes.
When you get down to the fine sand and below, what elevations are we at that point?
So this area right here, so the bottom of the smear zone is typically about 30 feet below the surface. So it depends on what it is, because bedrock can be down almost 90 feet. So you've got varying depths across the site depending on how the bedrock formation is.
All right.
And then once you get into bedrock, like the residential wells down gradient could be 500-600 feet.
Right.
So the site was listed on the national priorities list. And the reason for that is because of the extent of the contamination, its potential to impact a large population. This is a residential area. There's impacted wells that resulted from this groundwater contamination. And so when EPA comes on the site, there's a few things we do. And the first thing we do is a remedial investigation, which includes a risk assessment, because really that's what we're here to do, right? There's a site with hazardous substances, and EPA is here to address the risk and clean up the site. So it's important to know what the risk is. So the risk is a chance of harmful effects, right? So it's an estimate of the harmful effects to either human health or ecological systems. And we use a system with a risk assessment that we characterize the nature and extent of these risks. So we want to know, what are these risks and who are they for? And who is it for is important because we want to know which populations. Is it residential people? Is it recreational? Is it trespassers? What kind of population are we talking about, including ecological? Because we do look at wildlife, fish, etc. And when we calculate risk, risk is based on three things. So you need to know, what are your concentrations present? How much exposure do you have? And then you need to know how it affects you. So for every chemical that we look at, so here, when we did a risk assessment, we ended up looking at 73 different chemicals, so into the risk assessment. And then out of those chemicals, we need to look at what are the contaminant concentrations. So when you look at risk, what you're trying to do is narrow it down into what are the contaminants of concern. Each contaminant might present its own risk. Some contaminants are more toxic at low levels. Some are less toxic in the form that they're at. And so you need to know each and every chemical, and that factors into the risk for each chemical. So in soils, in the end, out of those 73 chemicals, they looked at 17 contaminants of concern. So what that means is it was essentially 17 chemicals that would present the most risk at the site. And the best ones, which means most prevalent, highest concentration, presenting the most risk, ended up being lead, which had concentrations in surface soils up to 20,000 part per million, PCBs, which were up to 700 part per million. I say greater than 50 because there's regulations that apply once it's greater than 50, and petroleum hydrocarbons. You saw those big tanks. And so what we're looking at is large tanks that leaked out, and in those tanks you had gasoline products. Back then it was leaded gasoline. So as it leaked, it's going to go through the soils, leaving components of this, including the lead, as it wants to go down to the water table. PCBs are normally associated with oils. They're typically put into different kind of capacitors, transformers, or other oils because they build up heat resistance. It makes the oil last longer. So it's an additive typically to oil. So it's usually associated with the oils.
So Cheryl, what's the, I don't know, the federal level for lead?
For lead. So cleanup wise, it's right now it's 400 part per million. And that's
Wow.
our cleanup level currently at the site.
Okay.
Depends on the use, though.
It depends on the use, right? If it's residential, if it's commercial, it could be 1,000. It could be higher. So
But
again,
either
it's
way,
based
you're
on the
blowing
risk.
it out of the
Yeah,
water at
you're
20.
20, you're 20, right?
Say that again?
You're blowing it out of the water at 20,000 parts per million.
It's much more significant, yes, and it's going to remain there, and it's going to, typically as things go for lead, you might get lower as it goes down. So again, the same thing, sediments, downgrading in Kelly Brook, typical, similar to soils, concentrations of PCBs and arsenic were the ones that where the contaminants are concerned. And then in groundwater, there are 21 contaminants of concern, and these included the chlorinated volatile organic chemicals. Now, again, there's a special class called the chlorinated VOCs, and what it typically means is PCE is perchloroethylene, and it's a chlorine compound with 4 chlorines. And if it's reduced, it can reduce to trichloroethylene. They're both degreases, they're both commonly used, and then it keeps going. DCE and DCA have 2 chlorines, and vinyl chloride actually has 1 chlorine compound, and it actually is the most toxic. And then you have benzene. I'm sure everyone's heard of gasoline, and you've heard of BTEX, benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene. So those compounds are there, with benzene being the most prevalent for risk. So what happens during an RI is lots, hundreds, maybe thousands of samples are taken. And if you can see in this, what I tried to do here is I found one of the old sampling. So this is for total petroleum hydrocarbons, one of the most prevalent compound. And what you can see here is that during the RI, when they were looking at where is the contaminant located, you can see the concentrations were focused right here, where all of those tanks and everything was located, because that's where most of the spills were. And I'm just going to blow it up a little bit here, if I can. So it's a little hard to see, and I can move it down in a second. But I just wanted to let you know that, so they look at this. These are surface soils. Oops, my laser's gone. So you can see these are all where the tanks were in the storage, and that's prevalent. If I come over here, and again, my technology is not as great, but you can start to see some of these numbers that are higher. So the total petroleum, as you can see, possibly here. Nope, my pointer's gone again. It doesn't want to keep the pointer. So over here you can see, it doesn't want to keep the pointer on this one, that it's up to 50,000 in some of these surface soils. But you can see each and every dot, it varies. It can be 50,000 next to 17,000 next to 6,000. So again, that has to factor in, how much is there? What is the average concentration? What is a reasonable maximum concentration? And even as we do it with surface, then there's a grid and we look at it down at depth, because again, everything that starts at the top wants to work its way down. So then samples were collected at depth so that we can understand, did it stop at 2 feet? Is it clean at 4 feet, or is it still contaminated at 10 feet? So all of that data was collected between both the pre-design investigations that have been performed and the RI. So it's looking at where is this contaminated and at what levels.
And what's the RI again? Just
Remedial investigation.
Remedial
so
investigation.
that's trying to understand and characterize the site. Now, again, when we look at petroleum hydrocarbons and we're looking at thousands of part per million, the cleanup level that eventually that was selected was 170. So again, comparatively, you can see that for some chemicals, it's more concentrated than others. So we can look at a lot of chemicals, and some may not be prevalent, they may not be across the whole site, or they may not be highly concentrated. So for groundwater during the remedial investigation, again, we have all these source areas. So we know there's the lagoon, and we know there is the on-site landfill and some of the releases. Each one of those leached, as we talked about. It made its way down into the groundwater. and form these plumes. So each one's different. So there was a recycling for trichloroethylene up here, and those leaks and spills formed a one plume up here. We have the lagoon plume, which is yellow. We have plumes from the storage of oil that has migrated, and then these are the solvent space from all of those tanks that has migrated. But as you can see, primarily it's moving across the site, mostly in the shallow to, next overburden aquifer zones, and moving into the residential area, heading down. This is Kelly Brook.
Yeah.
So groundwater in the shallow wants to come across.
And the
discharge.
top is Kelly Road, right?
Right. This is Kelly Road.
Yep.
Right. So in this picture, what I was showing is this is the monitoring. So this is the extent of the contamination as was known back in 2004. So this is when the remedy was done. This is what the groundwater plume looked like. And this is currently what we're looking at for groundwater. So all of these marks in yellow, this is the monitoring program that the BD Site Group has currently doing. So they're looking at these wells, they're looking at concentrations, monitoring the groundwater. What are the concentrations doing? Are they going up? Are they going down? How fast? What's the magnitude of that change? And I also want to point out, so these blue and purple houses are residential wells that are still using the aquifer. So back when the ROD was written, back in 2004, this aquifer was deemed to be high use and value. You didn't have another alternative water supply. This water was being used by residents for their primary drinking water supply. So there's a high value to it. And it still remains a high value. At this point, because of this contamination that migrated, some of the houses had been put on point of entry systems, which were, down at the well. And in 2013, several of these houses, a water line was connected by the BD Site Group. It was wells at the time. I believe it's coming into a water line. But at the time, there were wells. And some of these houses started getting connected. At this point, all of these houses in green that you see here have been connected to a water line. And there's different reasons for them being connected. So EPA can require it, as we had in the beginning with point of entry systems, if there's an impacted well above a drinking water standard. There's other reasons. If this plume is migrating, or if a household well shows some impact, the BD Site Group has offered to connect them, to initiate that connection earlier than it would be to let the concentration up. Or if they're at the edge of the plume and there's a concern that they would continue to pull the plume. So there's different reasons that it's been performed, but at this point, these are the houses that are on a water line.
And
Downgrading of the site.
And going to the wells, how deep are the wells? Are they at varying depths?
Yes.
What's the highest and lowest?
So I believe there's a couple very shallow water table dug wells on this side, and then some of the deepest ones I believe are 500 or 600 feet.
Okay. And at the BD site, you have the monitoring wells. How deep do those go?
So they vary. So because most of the contamination you're looking at in the early days, they do tend to be shallow. So we do tend to look at most of the wells in the shallow aquifer, and I do have a picture of it actually coming up, so I'll have to go back to that. But there is some deep overburden wells. There is no bedrock wells currently that is being monitored at the site. There was a few, potable wells from when the company was there. There's been some that have been shut down. But for the most part, along this area, there's still a data gap where we don't understand maybe what exactly is coming, into the deep overburden, into the bedrock, and then migrating into the site in the bedrock. We do know that the residential wells that were impacted were bedrock wells. So that remains a concern, which we can hit at the end. So this information we have, so now we know where it is in the soil, we know what concentrations we are, we know what chemicals we're looking at, we know the groundwater. So then EPA puts together a risk assessment. And this is a short take of what a risk assessment looks like. So really what it does, it's considering the risks, as we said, the exposure concentrations. It's looking at the different scenarios. So EPA looks at residential. You can look at workers on the site, trespassers on a site, recreational, who's using the water. And these are the different ways we look at it. Are they ingesting soil? And each one gets a calculation. If they're going to ingest soil, how many days? What's your exposure? How much of the dirt? What's the chemical on it? And each one factors into these equations. They look at the different toxicity values. Some chemicals are considered cancer-causing, some are non-cancer. And so they're equated a little bit differently. And then they're basically summed up through these equations, and they end up generating a risk. Do you have an acceptable or unacceptable risk? EPA has a risk range. So we consider acceptable risk to be 1 in a million to 1 in 10,000. excess cancer risk. So anything greater than 10 to the minus 4 would be an unacceptable risk because it's an increase in those risk numbers. Non-cancer, we use a hazard quotient of 1, so anything greater than that would be considered above our acceptable risk. So these scenarios are calculated with the different concentrations and the different toxicity values. And this is for the site. So the other thing that I wanted to mention that comes up, but I wanted to mention other aspects of risk. So this is a picture of the oil. So we talked about the oil sinking down into the water table and spreading out of the site. So this is the phase 2 area. So this is the former building area, the lower landfill. So this just gives you an idea. So we're looking down on this. So this is now 5 feet to 30 feet below the surface. And it's basically telling you, where is that oil? Where does it want to sit? Right? And where is it heaviest? Obviously the red are the heaviest. So this oil at the time, that before the rod was happening and just after, this oil is sitting here. And we call these 2 areas down here the lower lobe. So the sediments for the Kelly Brook were impacted because this oil, which migrated on the water table, kept moving towards Kelly Brook. So we have these 2 lobes where the oil would have come down on the water table. The water table here is pretty shallow. Obviously, we're approaching Kelly Brook. But it gives you a good idea, since this area right now is where we call the lower landfill. That's the cleanup we're doing right now, and this is the phase 2 area. And it's a great thing, but what we're concerned about here is 2 things. So one, we have oil, which is highly contaminated, so it's a principal threat. So it needs to be removed. EPA prefers treatment for principal threat materials. So anything highly toxic or highly mobile. So that is one of the measures that we need to address. It's a primary risk, but it's not part of that risk calculation. It's part of that addressing of risk. And the second aspect of that is that smear zone. So that smear zone's pretty deep. So maybe you're not going to be exposed to it in a residential recreational scenario, but it is deep and it is highly contaminated and it is leaching into the groundwater. So you still have a risk because the leaching into the groundwater is a problem, because the groundwater is a risk if somebody was to drink the groundwater. So you need to address the materials. Even though they're down deep, you may not be in contact with them, but they may leach to the groundwater. So that's how they factor in. And again, those deeper ones remain contaminated with, hydrocarbons, PCBs, and lead. So when we look at the different scenarios, you saw the residential, recreational, worker scenarios. That's what we use. So there's one thing that factors into risk. Again, the end of the cleanup is we want to have a cleanup scenario for a future use. And at the time, in 2004, there was a lot of discussion with the town, with the PRPs, on the reuse of the site. And reuse and redevelopment are different. Reuse is essentially categories, potential options. Residential can have a wide category of what could be residential. Recreational is a wide category of options. A redevelopment is typically a specific use. I want to use it for a soccer field or a building of a Home Depot. But reuse is kind of the options. It can be anything in that category. So when we looked at it at the time, the town had changed the zoning for the site, those 2 parcels, to medium density residential. The adjacent properties are all recreational, so you have families, you have everyone living in the area. The town's reuse plan, so the EPA provided the town with nearly $100,000 grant, and you performed a study looking, and you solicited comment from the town to look at what your plan would be, and what you would want the site. Now, in the end, it doesn't really matter what that plan is, if it's some residential, some recreational. The idea is that you're fitting it into what kind of reuse scenario, because we're going to use that for risk. So in the end, if it came back and said, we would like it to be maybe, community centers plus playgrounds, we want those options, then we're going to look at residential, recreational risk scenarios, because we want to be clean for anything that fits into those categories. So that's how we look at it. So now we do this entire risk assessment. At the end, we decide, which scenarios are an unacceptable risk and which scenarios are not. And EPA takes an action. We have to have a risk to take an action. So the risks that allowed us to go forward on an action were the risks related to the soil and sediment for ingestion, risks related to groundwater for ingestion, risks related to current and potential future residents, so somebody living on the site, using the site, catching fish, etc. Risks related to future trespassers or anybody recreational that might be by using the site for shorter periods of time, and leaching into the groundwater, as we described. So that's kind of the big risk assessment piece in a nutshell. So once we have this basis for action, we move into something called the feasibility study. And the feasibility study is essentially we're taking what we've identified for contamination, what we've identified for risk, and we're developing options and alternatives that would address those risks. So the feasibility study for the site came up with 4 particular options for addressing risk. And we have to look at no action. It's basically our standard to compare anything to. If we do nothing, what would happen? How long would it be there? Would it be accessible? Limited action, which is typically fencing, monitoring. Containment, which is typically your capping of some form, leaving things in place but putting a protective cover on it. And then treatment, which could be excavation because you're permanently removing it, to treatment, which is addressing the contaminants to reduce risk. So the different alternatives are developed to match those kind of categories. And then we have to compare each alternative to what we have as 9 criteria. And these are fairly important because the first 2 threshold criteria are the most important. First, we have to develop alternatives that are protective of human health. Do they address the risk? Do they remove the risk down to the levels that we deem to be protective? And that's important because no action, of course, didn't do anything, didn't touch the risk, so it's not acceptable. It doesn't pass the threshold criteria. And then the next one is compliance with AROS. Now that's the term I think is a little misleading. It's a little difficult to understand. So what it really means is, does your alternative meet your regulations? So again, when we look at the contaminants we have PCBs, and PCBs are regulated by the Toxic Substance Control Act. And what that means is that those PCBs are regulated. So if soils are excavated and those soils contain greater than 50 part per million, that regulation requires me to put that in a specific landfill that has a cover and leaching. So the soils at the site that were excavated greater than 50 have to go to a TSCR-approved landfill to be contained because of the leaching potential. If they're less than 50, they can go to a RECRD landfill, as we call it, which might be like your turnkey landfill. So there's specific regulations. If it's a liquid and it's PCBs, those regulations say they have to be incinerated. It's the only way to permanently destroy them. So the liquid oils, the napples that came out of the site, because they had PCBs greater than 50, the regulations require us to send them to be incinerated. So we have to make sure that our remedies comply with these regulations. The same for lead. Lead is managed under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So lead, if we look at lead and we excavated lead in sediment, and then we have to sample it, we look at this thing called TCLP. So basically what it means is, does it leach? So if your concentrations of lead that you're excavating leach, again, you have to go to a RCRA compliant landfill, because again, you're all constantly looking at these regulations. Now, again, we have the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and about 19 other pages of regulations, which I won't go into, but it tells you how we have to do it. And in our alternatives, we list what is the requirement, how is this remedy meeting it. So we have wetland protection orders, we have a lot of different ones. But again, it's a very important one because we're the Environmental Protection Agency, we have a lot of regulations, and those are the ones we have to address. So if it doesn't address it, it doesn't meet a threshold criteria. The rest of them are balancing. They compare the difference. Is there long-term monitoring associated with it? Is it sustainable? Is it going to be cost-effective? Will it be implemented in the short term? Is it a long-term cleanup? And how does it reduce toxicity and the mobility of the contaminants? Does it use treatment? Does it use long-term? So those are the things. And then after we have those alternatives, EPA actually goes out and does a public meeting, right? So we release our preferred plan. So out of all the alternatives, we say, this is the one we prefer. And EPA solicits comment. So that's what they did. And we got back comment from the town, the community, the PRPs on the different alternatives and the one that we preferred. And then we use those comments back to do our final, does the state agree with it? And do we have support from the town and the community? So that's the process of coming up with a remedy. It's a very long process. This one lasted, I think, from 98 to 2005, to get that information. So it is a long process, but I just wanted to make sure we overviewed how we come up, how we look at it, and it's a pretty involved. And if you want to read more, there's probably 30,000 pages of documents you can have out of the site file that detailed it into a longer scenario.
A quick question for you.
Mm-hmm.
When you start a project like this, is the standards of the year that the project started is what goes forward, or are they modified as the standards change year to year?
So, yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually the 5-year review. So they're frozen in place at the time of the remedy. So the standards are in place, but the 5-year review allows you to review what's currently protective and determine if your remedy remains protective with those levels, or does it need to change to be protective.
So it's a moving target.
It can be.
Okay.
If it's deemed not to be protective, no longer to be protective.
Cheryl, hold on one second. I just want to, for the gentleman out in the audience, we're going to table the Davis Park discussion for tonight. I just don't want you to have to sit through all this and wait to speak. So we're going to move it to a future meeting, probably in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
All right. Please proceed.
Okay, so after the proposed plan goes out and we get the comments, EPA releases what we call a ROD, a record of decision. And that ROD is basically the comprehensive remedy, which is intended to address the human health and ecological threats. So in the end, this remedy addressed source control. So it addressed the removing of the direct contact threat with the contaminated soils, and we did that through selections of excavation and of the contaminated soil and sediment. It eliminated known sources of groundwater contamination, and that was done with the deeper soils, treatment of the deeper soils, removal of the oils. It managed the groundwater contamination by removing the threats of ingestion, your point of entry systems. It used a groundwater treatment system to restore the aquifer and to prevent plume migration. So, and then what's in every single remedy typically is long-term monitoring. How is it? Is that action effective? Are the contaminants reducing? Did that work? And institutional controls. So those are typically your fencing, signs, deed restrictions. Do not use this well until levels have returned to clean. So those are the components of what a remedy is and what this remedy is. So now I'm going to go through a few things of the cleanup remedy. Now I know you've all heard our discussion, so you know the groundwater treatment plant's been installed and is operating. You know that the thermal remediation process took part in two aspects of it and was undeniably successful. So I'm just going to hit on a few other things that maybe didn't come out in some of those presentations. So this is the management migration aspect of it. So what I have here is just to demonstrate for you that this was the plume, this is the boundary of the plume back in 2013 when the groundwater management system was constructed. These green dots here are where the wells are. So you can see if the groundwater is coming this way, the idea is that these wells are capturing the migration of the plume as it moves through and capturing it before it moves into the residential area in the shallow overburden. And what it looks like on a cross-section is similar to what you asked me before. Where are these wells located? If you can see, most of these wells that are doing the extraction are in this silty sand materials. They're not in the deeper till or bedrock at this time. You know, most of the contamination at the time of the site was in that silty sand, and that's what this was designed to capture. I think there was an issue with making sure that water wasn't captured or there was no impact in residential wells so that they didn't want to get water. So there was that concern at the time. And also for Kelly Brook, there's always been a concern of making sure there's not enough pumping that it would dry out Kelly Brook. So all of those factors went in. And then, as I said, the thermal remediation. So there was both the phase 1 and the phase 2 thermal remediation. And, again, this little picture here depicts the early discussion I have where you have oil, it makes its way down to the water table. It's going to pool up at this water table and it's going to leach into the water. This diagram over here shows you that when you're in these soils, so as it's moving down, it's going to get stuck. As it's moving, the water table's up and down, that oil is going to get trapped. That's what your smear zone looks like, is pooled water and oil, and it's being held together, held there. So the thermal remediation was the injection of steam to force out these globules of oil that are being held in these soil materials in addition to the pooled material. So that's what the targeted treatment was. And again, highly successful. This is a picture of the lagoon area thermal operations, and this is the area of phase 2, which is your lower the upper landfill and storage tank area. And again, at the end, there was significant oil, probably more than we expected. At the time, but there was recovered of over 70,000 gallons of oil. Now, this is in addition to the 99,000 gallons of oil EPA removed from the water table in 2005. So you can see that the capacity of this site and the soils to hold on to this oil is significant. This is only a few acres. It's not a significant area. And the ability of these steam these steam operations to remove it was significant. I mean, absolutely impressive. And again, that reason why is that oil is a highly contaminated oil. So there was no chance for this groundwater to recover without the removal of that oil. So that by far is the most significant aspect for the recovery of the groundwater at the site.
And what are the bottom three pictures?
So one of the things I want to show you is that, as we showed you with, the different concentrations, this drum may have dripped over here and given you this concentration or this chemical. The same thing happens with groundwater. So some of the areas of the site are fairly clean. You're going to get very normal looking groundwater. Some are going to be light yellow, in different areas. So this is actually a picture. It's light green because there was an antifreeze recycling next to the old plant in the phase 2 area. So the old green dyes, there was none of the propylene glycol, but there's still remnants of this green dye that might be in the water. So you know what you're looking at there. Some of them might be more muddy with the oils. And this is a picture of layers. So one of the things that what happened when the extractions were happening is you can get entrained air in with the oils too, and this emulsion forms. And this is this light area, and what it does is it basically volumizes the oil because it traps it. So that was one of the things that had to be dealt with during the operations because it expanded the oil, and that was harder to break down. So that took a little longer and a lot more effort. But again, highly successful. The BD site group stayed with it. The operations went long. They stayed with it to the end and got all of the oil off of the site. And I really think as they were recognized by EPA, it really was a tremendous effort. And they do get kudos for that. But I think, in showing the pictures, I just wanted you to see what does it mean when we say there's oil in the water? What does it mean when we say this is what we're seeing, So this is the Lower landfill. So this is the most recent action. So because this Lower landfill in Kelly Brook is so close to Kelly Brook, we couldn't inject steam. You can't get that, those boiling temperatures that close. So the Lower landfill, there's two components to that. So one, that's an area that EPA said should be naturally attenuated because it's going to be hard to do pump and treat there because you'll pull from Kelly Brook. So you want to remove the sources. So this area was a little bit different than some of the other aspects of the site. So it has this lower area of the landfill, lower area of the smear zone from that NAPL picture I showed you, and where those lobes came out and went into Kelly Brook. So that's what this is addressing.
What's the problem with pulling from Kelly Brook?
Well, if you lower the water table, you'll lower Kelly Brook, and then you'll have an ecological problem because you'll have no more water.
I mean, Kelly Brook is almost non-existent.
At times of the year, it's very low. It's very low. And the BD site group has, there was a lot of studies back done in 2013 to look at the different flows and to determine what would be the lowest flow that was acceptable that you could still maintain. And I think, and then at that point, when we get to that, so the pump and treat system actually shifts in the fall when the Kelly Brook goes low, and they lower how much water they extract so that they're not drawing. But the other thing is you don't want to draw Kelly Brook water into your system as well.
Okay.
And you don't want to use the steam cleaning or the steam process next to it because you'll just superheat the water.
Right. So one of the things I put in here, so this picture here, I added this one. So this is what the Lower landfill area looked like before it was excavated. Not really much. If you can't see contaminants, if you can't see underground, this is what you see. You see dirt, you see plants. This is what, if you walk the site, this is what you'd see before we said it needs to be cleaned up. I bring that back because the visuals, a lot of people want to see what it looks like, and this is what you see. It's the lab analysis that tells us, how bad it is. So, and I point that out because when we go to the next pictures, this is what the Lower landfill excavation looked like. So here's the top of the ground that we just showed you. And this is the Lower landfill. So you can see this is about 20-foot slope down here. So this sheet pile wall was installed when they did the thermal. So that holds back the heat from going to Kelly Brook, holds back the oil, allows them to recover the water, kind of contains it. So this is a wall that's actually going to stay in place. It goes down about 32 feet. So it goes down to where the end of that smear zone is, because that's where the end of the treatment was. So this excavation, because it's natural attenuation, they were removing all sources to groundwater. So they've got to remove the smear zone to the cleanup levels. They've got to remove the lower landfill, the soils to the cleanup level, and then the sediments, which had a little bit different cleanup levels. So this is what it looks like when the excavation happens. This area of the site up above it was actually just backfilled. I mean, just excavated because of the sheet pile wall. They didn't want the soils to be up top, so they excavated down behind the sheet pile wall for that support area. So this is a deeper excavation. So this area right here corresponds to that lobe. When you saw the picture of the lobe going out, that's that smear zone. So that's why that area went down deeper, because that's where the lobe is. So here's another view from a different angle. Here's the top of the ground that you might be walking on from that first picture. Here's the landfill materials. Here's your sheet pile wall. The excavation, as you see, water comes in. This is oils that are coming in. That's great, because this is what we're removing, right? This is the oils that we want to remove from the site. So here's the material, as you can see, large equipment coming into the site, performing their excavation. Now, this sheet pile wall goes all the way around this lower landfill area. This is the Kelly Brook sediment cleanup. It's shallower. It doesn't have the smear zone because the oils kind of ran out. They stopped at one point. So this outlined where the smear zone was and that they could excavate safely within that. Then the cleanup of the Kelly Brook happened on the outside of it. The sheet pile wall itself, was stained with oils. So it also was cleaned before it was before the backfilling of soils came back into the site. The down gradient ones, the ones that surrounded it, so if this is the phase 2 one, so this stays at the top of the slope, the ones that surrounded it were all cleaned and then pulled out at the end.
You're leaving the sheet piles in place.
Just this sheet pile that's in place, that's on the up gradient side of it. So where it separated the full excavation from where it still remains with the landfill and the oils. What it does is it helps control the groundwater too. It helps, so that it doesn't migrate down. I mean, because again, groundwater, in the thermal treatment. So when you add heat, you're not only stripping the soil, so a lot of the materials that may have desorbed and adsorbed, like arsenic, naphthalene in them, what they're going to do is they're going to dissolve into the water. So the first thing that happens is a lot of your concentrations go up really high because you've added the heat, you've desorbed it, your groundwater concentrations are very high. So those need to be collected with those systems and then treated. And then after that excavation, this is the backfill of materials into those excavated areas and the site restoration. So to point out where you are, so again, up here is the top of the soils at the site from the first picture. This is where it was slightly excavated to protect this white line right here. That is the sheet pile wall. So as you can see, you cannot see it. It is back underground. So, doing its thing. So it's protecting things 32 feet underground, but this is where it is. And then this is a grass mat. So this is holding on to seedlings and grasslings. And then the plantings were provided by the Beatty Site Group and some habitat restoration for Kelly Brook. So this picture over here is if you were standing on this side of the fence, down at this end of it, this is the Kelly Brook. There's like a ponded area where it comes from Kelly Road and comes around the corner past the site. So this is the water as it passes the site on the upside. And then on the downside, it's flowing past this side. So this was that lower lobe we showed you in the picture. This is, this was like a 4-foot excavation, and this is the restored ponded area, Kelly Brook. So this is what the restoration happened, and I think this ended, this was finished, we did the site inspection on this in mid-December. And that's when these pictures were taken.
And how deep down was that dig?
So at the deepest, I believe it was 28 feet, and that was just to get to that smear zone. And again, it's because this area doesn't have any requirements for future cleanup. It needed to be clean at this point, so all sources had to be removed.
Right.
So the 5-year review. So every 5 years, EPA has to review the site and review the protectiveness and review whether the current the standards at the time or new standards need to be looked at. So this is our second 5-year review. The first one was in 2017, which came 5 years after the start of the MOM system. So it's kind of triggered by a construction action. So this is our second one. EPA writes these. It's under our purview. And really what a 5-year review does is it evaluates the current status, summary of the cleanup. It evaluates the functions of the remedy. It evaluates the current protectiveness of the remedy against any changes there may be in toxicity, exposure, risk, and any standards, cleanup standards, because those things change as well. It asks, has any other information to come into question that you might want to look at? And then in the end, it comes down to issues and recommendations. If there's something that might be, information that we need to still continue to understand whether or not the remedy will be protective. And then at the end, we have a protectiveness statement. So the current site conditions. So now, again, this report is on the town's website. It's a more detailed report. I kind of grabbed some of the highlighted conclusions here, but if you want more information, that's where I would go for it. So again, this reiterates that the phase 1 and phase 2 thermal operations were very effective at the removal of the light non-aqueous phase liquids on the water table and trapped in the soils, and therefore it removed the VOCs from the soils that we're going to continue to leach. Those all met soil cleanup standards in those 2 areas, which is significant. And then the operation of the groundwater treatment system continues to decrease concentrations in the extent of the shallow VOC plume. So those 7 wells that are extracting have done a good job reducing concentrations and capturing that plume. 1,4-dioxane. So 1,4-dioxane was a fairly new contaminant, 2005 about for EPA. I think the site started looking at it in 2008. It's associated with other chlorinated solvents. It's pretty much ubiquitous now at all of our sites that had chlorinated solvents. However, it is a very hard chemical, so because it's miscible with water, so it wants to get in the water and move. So we typically find it farther away, down gradient than most of the other chemicals. So 1,4-dioxane was found in groundwater at the site. It's not widespread in shallow groundwater, and overall concentrations have declined. Now that's probably not unexpected because it doesn't want to stick to the soils, so it wants to move down deeper and move off the site. So therefore, it's not also unexpected that 1,4-dioxane remains detected above the New Hampshire drinking water standards in the intermediate and deeper bedrock aquifers. In fact, the highest concentration right now on site. Now, again, we don't have wells in some of the areas, but right now, for the data we do have, the highest concentration is off-site in the residential area. Because
this 5-year synopsis of now may be exponentially out of whack 5 years from now.
it'll be reevaluated every 5 years. Some of our sites, I think I have other sites that are on their 7th 5-year review, 35 years of reviewing. And it's a little difficult because, like with 1,4-dioxane, that came about after the remedy. So it's a new contaminant. Some of our toxicity, and I'll talk about that, some of our toxicity, what might have been acceptable back in 2004
Right.
is no longer acceptable. So then you have to look at whether the site would be protective.
Does that lead to more remediation?
It can, if it's deemed to be unacceptable. It can.
It might be worth adding, that can happen in between 5-year reviews too.
Right.
Right. So it doesn't just mean at the 5-year review, that's when we look at that. If there are new standards that come out within that time frame, we don't just wait until the next 5-year review to look at that.
Okay.
Right. And that's great. So one of the things that we can say is 1,4-dioxane was in 2008, and we know it's in the groundwater. We know it's in the residential area. So the BD site group analyzes for it. They're treating for it in the groundwater plume. They've got an advanced oxidation system, which treats the 1,4-dioxane. So even though it hasn't been, added as a contaminant of concern, they're treating for it. They're capturing it. We're analyzing for it. So we understand where it is, how high the concentrations are, and where it's going.
Okay. That answers a good question because I know, for instance, arsenic 20 years ago, you drank it as part of your diet.
Yeah.
Now it's a bad
Not
thing.
recommended now, huh? But arsenic is a good one too because the cleanup standard back then was 50 and then it's moved down to 10. So the standards change as well.
Right.
And arsenic is in our groundwater. Arsenic is a naturally occurring substance. However, when you have reducing compounds, or reducing conditions in a soil, so you have the hydrocarbons and everything, it's stripping the soil. So you end up you mobilize some of this too. So you can see higher concentrations. And again, our concentrations of arsenic in groundwater are greatest in the shallow groundwater in the source areas. And that's, again, because you've got all these conditions.
Okay.
And again, that comes back as a general theme. Highest concentrations tend to be in source areas. They tend to be in areas with those large tanks were stored and leaked over time, continuously, and at depth. And then we have, in addition to the 1,4-dioxane, we have per and polyfluorinated substances. Now, these go by different names: PFAS, forever chemicals. They've been in the news for a while. EPA required the analysis of them at the site, and we started with a phased approach, looking at the site. They were on site in groundwater, then it gets spread out further, so that we now know where the PFAS is in the wells that we have on site. So really, it follows that same pattern. The highest concentrations of polyfluorinated substances, which EPA primarily looks at PFOA and PFOS. Those are the two acronym of the two that we primarily look at, are highest in the phase 2 area, where the rest of the higher concentrations are as well. And then in the lagoon area as well. So those are the highest concentrations, but we also have it in groundwater as it's moving towards parcel 2, and we also have it in the residential area.
Sure.
So, and again, that chemical also likes to move with it. It may not go down to bedrock, but it seems to be prevalent, at least in the higher concentrations in the either in the water table area by the source areas or in the deeper overburden as it's moving toward the residential properties. But again, and as you said, so we've identified it. And in 2018, when it was identified on site, because that groundwater is removed from the ground, treated and put back in the ground, the discharge criteria had to meet the state standards. So right away, the BD site group put in 2 activated carbon systems, and the groundwater started being treated almost immediately, which is pretty unheard of. But almost immediately, the groundwater started being treated for these compounds so that the discharge criteria could be met. So that shallow groundwater is also being captured and treated. So, but right now, so here's the confusing part about PFAS. So talk about changing concentrations. I think in the last 3 or 4 years, it's been yearly. So we started off with maybe an acceptable criteria of 70, which was a health advisory number. The state of New Hampshire established cleanup criteria for 4 different compounds, including PFOA and PFOS. That I think PFOA is 12 and PFOS is 15. So that was used in case there's a resident that may have exceeded that. They became somebody that would be required to get on the water line. And now EPA has revised the reference dose. So basically they revised the risk for it. So back in May of 2022, EPA lowered what we're looking at for standards in groundwater. So now EPA's regional screening levels, which is what is the lowest level we're looking for, is 4 and 6. So it's fairly low concentrations, and I know that EPA has a plan. They're categorizing them as hazardous substances. Eventually, they'll get what we call MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels, and those are federal drinking water standards in groundwater. But they're not there yet. But in the meantime, we do have the state's levels that we can compare it to. The BD site group, we can compare it to those lower levels that we're looking at. And we can also assess whether or not there's risk. So because we have this new toxicological information, we can go back to that risk assessment that we talked about, and we can say, at this concentration, is there going to be a risk? And above certain concentrations on site, because we do have pretty high concentrations, there is a risk for these compounds. So we do understand it. So there is protections in there, because there's already people drinking, not drinking the water. They're on the water line. It's being addressed. So that all factored into the 5-year review. What's happening with it, even while we're addressing it as a new substance that is at the site and needs to be investigated.
Gotcha. Janet, Cheryl, one question. The folks that are on the water line, that's the BD group. They're paying for that in perpetuity?
So no, they pay for the connection. So our National Contingency Plan allows us to connect people to water, but they don't allow us to pay for the monthly water bills and stuff like that.
Okay.
They allow
So it's
the
just the
connection.
connections, and the residents now have a water bill that are connected to that. Okay. And on here you talk about the no current residential water supply exceeds the New Hampshire PFAS. So are they continuing, or BD or the EPA continuing to test those wells like on a periodic basis?
Yep, they have an annual monitoring schedule that they look at for the wells, and then we're looking at them against the New Hampshire standards, because those are the established standards at this point.
Right. So New Hampshire will get the results from BD Site Group, and we send out the letters as we are looking and evaluating them against the New Hampshire standards. And so that last bullet point is reflective of the data that just came in the from the fall sampling that was performed in the residential wells.
Okay.
So those letters will be going out probably within the next couple weeks, and none of those were exceeding the PFAS
Well, that's good.
standards. Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah, that's good news.
It is. That doesn't mean, so, and I think this is the hard thing to explain. So because our screening levels are lower, they're 4 and 6, we might evaluate. So somebody's house might be above EPA's regional screening level for concentrations, which we do have, but below the state standards. So we're number based. So if it exceeds the state standards, they would get bottled water or connection, whatever would be the next step.
Right.
Our levels are still for investigation until EPA has those federal drinking water standards.
Who takes precedent, EPA or the state?
Interesting comment. So because EPA doesn't have any right now, so it goes to whoever's strictest, just to be honest. But so right now, because we don't have any, theirs is the strictest, right? Because they have some. However, because of the relationship with the federal and the states in New Hampshire, if EPA were to lower the standards, say we picked a number like 4, then the state would also have to lower theirs to 4. So eventually our MCLs would have to be their MCLs.
Gotcha.
So the key to that is that the states can act faster in their regulations than the federal can. So
That's a surprise.
to everyone in this room.
Yeah. So the report, as I said, we went through the current status. There was a lot of descriptions in the report about, the current actions, the cleanup and the status and how well it's doing, and looking at the data. And at the end of it, it comes down to, is there any issues and recommendations? What are the issues and recommendations that might affect the protectiveness of the remedy? Okay, so these are the issues and recommendations that we presented in the report that need to continue to be reviewed to see how if or will it affects the protectiveness. So the first one is the one for dioxin and PFAS. We don't have cleanup standards for them. We've got to identify whether or not they should be a contaminant concern, because they continue to be migrating in the intermediate deep overburden and in the bedrock. We need to continue our bedrock investigation to see exactly the extent of those at the deeper levels. We have PFAS concentrations in groundwater within and down gradient of the BD properties, and which exceed EPA's regional screening levels and over our EPA risk-based levels. So in this map, you can see on this map, the circles actually, I don't know if I can make it bigger, the circles actually kind of represent concentration. So you can kind of see, where the higher concentrations are as you're approaching the line. So, of course, this would be our concern here. Over here, it's a little hard. They just did the thermal. We know that there might be elevated concentrations for a while. It'll be interesting to see as this monitoring goes, how those concentrations, if they're moving to the mom, if they're staying there. So we're going to be continuing to evaluate that. These concentrations, which are moving down towards parcel 1, parcel 2, and down to the resident, obviously that's going to be of higher concern and further investigations to see, are they moving? Are they continuing to move? Because again, if they are, and they're not being captured in the bedrock, because of the way the system is designed, do we need to optimize the mom? Do we need to go from shallow excavation to adding deeper excavations to make sure none of these contaminants can continue to migrate beyond the PD property into the residential area? So that's how you take the concentration, the data, and then determine if there's a risk and if an action needs to happen, and what would that action be.
And how long would you monitor to determine what the remediation would be?
So in the report, there's actually a time that we set for when we want to do this work or when we want to get the answers from it. So I believe this one is out 5 years because it takes a while to look at the bedrock investigation, assess where it's moving, because bedrock flow is moving through lineaments and fractures. And so you've got to try to identify those and find that groundwater pathway, migration pathway, which is a little more difficult than an overburden where it might be more distributed. So we have within 5 years to assess the bedrock contamination and any migration and any optimization of the mom.
And how does that affect the next phase of excavation?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't. This is a completely separate. And and as we look at it, a lot of this backside over here behind the mom, a lot of this, so the contamination originally went here and would be discharging this way or moving this way. And a lot of these wells have been reduced. I mean, there's very few wells on site that are being monitored anyway, that have those VOCs anymore. So that has been significantly impacted by this MOM system, by the thermal systems, reducing all the contaminants by stripping out all those sources. So the groundwater for those chlorinateds have really drastically improved based on the data we've seen. So it might be like some of our other sites, these other contaminants. It might be, that it's turning more into a 1,4-dioxane or a PFAS plume. Which
Drastically improved to me, though, is sort of like Jello, it's drastically improved over what and at what level, I mean, from starting point, if you took 50 gallons out of there, that's drastically improving, okay? But to me, the marker always is, what do we get now? Show me what you got now,
Right. So, and that is hard. Groundwater is a hard beast. So when we do these pump and treat systems, you're moving a lot of the groundwater, but of course, groundwater moves on the easiest path, right? So it's going to take longer to remove contaminants from a till, longer to remove them from areas where the water doesn't want to move as fast. So if you've got a sandy soil, you're going to move that water faster. You're going to collect more water and be able to treat more water. So these wells that are on this upside are nearly clean, if not clean. So these extraction wells on this point don't carry much contaminants because there's not much going into it. Obviously, the ones coming on the source area have more contaminants. Eventually, you'll get to the point in most of EPA's groundwater treatment systems, you've moved around the wells, you've tried to get all of the contaminants you can, and then you'll end up with, a residual amount of contaminants that the MOM system is no longer effective. You're pulling in too much clean water to effectively clean those little bits that are coming in. So eventually what you want to end up with is a site where you've cleaned it up enough that then you can go back and decide whatever's the residual either continues to not impact groundwater, the levels have dropped so low, or it's not going to migrate off site. And then you're going to end up with a groundwater management zone, which is another piece of these issues that kind of reviews it and looks at it over time. So that becomes the long piece. So groundwater is the much longer. Soils can clean up pretty fast. If you remove them and put back materials, you're done. You've met that. But groundwater is a much longer piece. I think we were all happy to see your water line come in. That was coming in. I mean, that's a significant aspect and avenue for the town because it takes so much longer.
Very good.
So the recommendation would be to complete the deep overburden and bedrock investigations, understand the vertical and horizontal extent of this contamination, assess if it's a risk and if it's a contributing to the risk assessment, and whether we need to optimize that MOM system to capture these things. They're already being treated, so I didn't have to add that. So the second one is the oil. So this accumulation. So I know we said we've removed a ton of oils, and they have. So I do not want to lose that point. However, like everything else, when it's trapped, not everything comes out. So there's this residual oil that is in some of the wells, not in all of the wells, in some of the wells, in the phase 1 and phase 2 area. And we know that because these wells still exist, and they go off and they do what they call LNAPL monitoring, how much is there. And what happened is after phase 1, we saw this residual NAPL. So they started removing this NAPL. And here's an example. So this is a belt skimmer. So this is there's 3 on site. And what it does is it sits over a well where they've identified a significant amount of oil that seems to want to accumulate. And it's not letting me, letting me do the video. No, let's see.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. So if you can see this, I don't know if you can see it, but the shiny on the belt skimmer, that's the oil. So this belt comes down, hits the water table, hits the oil, drags the oil up, and what it's going to do is it's going to scrape it off, and that oil is going to go through a tube and collect in a drum. So that's the operation of one of those skimmers. There's 3 of those going, and they're going on the 3, areas of highest residual. And again, if you see in the report, I think there's a total of maybe 159 gallons, of oil that may have been collected over the years, which of course is a significant volume, but not significant compared to the 100,000 in 2005 and the nearly 100,000 again. So there is some there. The issue with it remains the same. If the oils have PCBs greater than 50, which they do, they still represent an issue that we must address. So at this point, the issue is we still have this material. We're still investigating it. So what you see here is, so one of the things, oops, go back to my pointer.
So that video is from mid-December of 22.
Yep. And so, we had our consultants, our oversight consultant, Sanborn Head and Associates, go out. So what you're seeing here, so these white things in the back here, these are called socklets. So what they are, they're big absorbent booms, essentially, that go down these wells, and they absorb the oil while it's sitting on the water table so that it can collect it. And then they pull these out. So you can see what happens after they've sat for a while. They're saturated in oil, and they come out. And this is an effective, passive way of removing, because most of the time it's a thin layer of oil that's collecting, so it can continually remove it. This is one, it's easy to see when you see it not on a screen, but it's just in the presentation. And this was a baler that went down, so we could collect the oil, so we could sample it. So this is what it looks like when you take it out. So again, and the purpose of this isn't so much alarming. It's more to give you that visual. So when we say to people, we're collecting the oil, there's oil still at the site, we want you to know what we're talking about and what it represents to you.
And how deep is it you're going down to collect that oil?
That's water table.
Water?
Yep, because again, it wants to sit on the water
Yep.
table.
And what's that, 30 feet, 50 feet?
Depends on the well. It could
Depends
be
on the
anywhere
well.
from 5 feet down by the wetlands, and that was cleaned up. So most of it's down like 14, 18 feet.
They're all up on the upper portion where the thermal used to be right now.
So phase 2 area. So the issue for this, oops, I think it started again, sorry. So again, the issue for this is, the recommendation is to continue to remove the accumulated oils, and then assess what we need to do with this. Is this impacting groundwater still? Does it need to be removed or addressed in any other manner? Is this a problem? Is it not moving? Anything else that has to do with whether or not there needs to be another action taken to address this material.
Without removing it, what would happen over time? Would it flush itself?
Not likely. It might degrade. But again, you're going to lose so much of it, and then you kind of get something a little more solid. But this oil's, at least been there since the 1990s, if not
Yeah.
a lot longer than that.
Okay.
And then again, this is the third of the issues. So again, we talk about toxicity. EPA has a lead cleanup level of 400 part per million in soils. And again, we have surface soils with about 20,000, all the way down to 10 feet. We're still 400 to 1,000 in some areas. Some may even be higher, depending on, it's right underneath one of those large petroleum tanks that tripped. And again, it's not everywhere at the site. Again, the focus seems to be those areas where those materials were. So EPA set a 400 ppm cleanup level, and that equated to a blood lead level, specifically for a child, of 10 microgram per deciliter. And what EPA is now investigating is whether or not the blood lead level considered should be 5 micrograms per deciliter blood per child, and that would equate to a 200 part per million cleanup level. So the assessment we have to do is to look at how that would impact the site. And they've already started this. The BD site group did it as part of the remedial design for the lower landfill. They decided that they came back and evaluated that there is lead in the lower landfill. However, all of the concentrations that were above 200 were included in the excavated soils. So nothing remains that's greater than 200. So the same kind of analysis will have to be done. Our expectation looking at it, because again, we have volumes of data in grids and depths, the expectation is the levels are averaging over 400. So 200 wouldn't necessarily change too much of the depth. It might change more some of the lateral where it dispersed and spread out, but it may not be, it may not represent a significant amount. But we're supposed to do an evaluation of what this would affect the site if we do 200.
Does any of that below ground pose any kind of a health risk above ground?
So when they look at a residential scenario, and they look at it down to 10 feet. So, and the reason why they do it is multifaceted, but it's essentially, lots of things happen on properties. You can install utilities, which might go down to 6 feet. You can install trees. You can install a basement. So what the idea is that anything that could be in that depth can get to the surface. Okay. And then it's the surface exposure that's a risk. So you're cleaning it up so that any future action doesn't come to the surface.
Gotcha.
And this is the fourth issue. Do you want to?
Sure. So we, as part of the consent review, one of the things that's required is the establishment of a groundwater management zone, which is managed by New Hampshire DES. But this is something that we will be looking at to establish after the investigation that we had talked about in issue 1. So when using that information and that data to fill in those data gaps, the state would work with EPA to set up a groundwater management zone that would look at evaluating on whatever, it would issue a permit to the parcel holders, owners, to sample in a annual or whatever basis was established for contaminants, not only including the contaminants of concern, but anything else that was found to be near or above AGQS on the site. And so that can also change even once it's established. We have the ability to modify those on, usually we get an annual summary report. It's very similar to the process of the monitoring that's currently done, but the state would be reviewing that and then altering it, adding and subtracting wells as needed and extending or retracting the groundwater management zone depending on what the data was looking like.
Right. So as part of the record of decision, as I said, there was long-term monitoring and institutional controls. So what EPA does in our consent decrees is we typically get to the point where we're doing those major cleanups, and at the end, we kind of move on the long-term monitoring to the state of New Hampshire to manage under the groundwater management permit, as well as looking at the residential water, and then doing those deed notices to restrict the water. So we ask them to do that for the state of New Hampshire. So that's almost on every single site, how they manage that.
Yes.
So again, because we have an established one, it's an issue that we needed to indicate to be protective. So at the end, we write a protectiveness statement. And in the report, it's a long one because I have to address all of these issues in line. But today I'm going to say it's protective in the short term. There's nobody drinking the contaminated water because actions have been taken to ensure that they did not. The site is monitored. The groundwater is being treated. It's effectively discharging. The site is fenced, so there's no trespassing on the site. There's fencing to protect people or warn people. So in the end, the site is protective in the short term. Okay, so that means this exposures are being controlled, essentially, is what that means. In order for the remedy to be protective in the long term, the remedial action that was designated in the ROD needs to be completed, and the issues and recommendations that we just went through also need to be completed. So the soils excavation needs to be completed because that's the final phase for us and must meet the criteria set in the ROD for future residential reuse, and the groundwater cleanup levels need to be achieved. And that's going to be the long-term one, which is why you can have your 7th 5-year review, is because in the end we have to do this as long as contamination remains on site. So we have to evaluate this every 5 years. And typically in the end, most of these end up with groundwater reviews because that will take the longest. So it was a pretty
So that
immediate.
could be a long time before the evaluation is completed and be satisfied, I should say.
Right. And then at that point, you could have delisting of the site. You've met all your criteria. The site can be delisted. And you can do it while it's moved on. You know, we have other sites where, construction has happened on a site, of course, and you're still monitoring the groundwater. So it doesn't change. As long as your source controls and those aspects of risk have been addressed, you can move on with those kind of future actions for it.
Okay.
Especially if you have groundwater and you're not in need of it. So that's it. So the last thing I can say is, thank you for the long sitting there listening to us on this long presentation.
Very informative.
As Jay knows, I am a talker. I can talk about this for hours, but it's what I like to do. But he also asked me what's next. So I'm just going to tell you what's next. So the lower landfill and Kelly Brook sediment cleanup, the field work part of it was completed in December. So as you saw from the pictures. So we're still waiting to get a report. We get something called the remedial action report that kind of summarizes all the work they did, finishes giving us as-built drawings, etc. So that will come in May or June. And then we're also going to move forward. We actually have a meeting this Wednesday, and we're going to talk about the 2 other aspects. One is groundwater. We've ensured that our oversight people have brought on a bedrock hydrologist that they can, parallel with doing the soils and the rest of the cleanup, also be addressing the groundwater. We want to make sure that they're both on a fast track. So we're going to be talking this Wednesday about what needs to be done for groundwater, whether it needs to be, additional investigations or additional data collection, whatever we need to do to kind of get to an understanding of that, as well as looking at what are the next stages for the pre-design investigation. So we finish one design, we move into the next remedial design, and there's a lot of components with the last piece of it. So, in addition to the soils, there are soil piles on site, large soil piles on site that have petroleum and PCBs and lead, and we have to address when those, need to be removed, as well as there's a large building on site that's still there. And so, some of the site work, may get proposed. And again, that hasn't been discussed yet. But like many of the other ones, if there's some kind of site prep work that can be done early, that may be able to be happen.
Do you have a ballpark of how much time you think?
I believe we've got to finish this RD for the soils we're looking at 24. So we probably have at least 2 years after that for the soil cleanup.
The remedial design would be in 24.
Yes.
And there's no way of telling when it's done.
For groundwater?
Yeah.
No, not yet. It's a little hard to see what the residual contamination is when groundwater is always moving past it. You kind of have to wait. We've had other sites, and then unfortunately, depending on what your soil material is, if it's very, very sandy, you may not have a long recovery. But if you've got a lot of clays, it's going to trap those contaminants in and not want to give it up, and it's going to be a very slow diffusion, which may be good or bad. Because it may not move very far. So it's going to depend on what we see.
Well, we'll hope for the best.
Any other questions from the board? I guess one question I do have is, are there any actions from the town that we need to take at this point, or we just wait for the updates from the EPA and the BD group as progress continues?
Yeah, right now I think there's been renewed interest. I mean, I think COVID was difficult, to be honest, during that time, and the thermal was keep going, and no one really went out there to see that. So I think what we need to do is just keep coming back and letting you know where we're at, what the actions are going to be, what we think is going to happen next, what the timelines are for our actions. Yeah.
And I would just add, so my colleague here, Aaron Shaheen, is also here with me, and he's going to be kind of the lead community involvement coordinator. And with all these actions coming up and activity on the site and interest, if there's things that you hear that you'd like feedback from us on, if there's community members that would be useful, or community groups that are active that would be useful for us to communicate with, we're happy to do that too. And we'll be working on, EPA often does, and it's different on every site. And I know the BD site group does a lot of communications and outreach with the public too. So we'd like to think a little bit about the best way that we could do that, especially if there's going to be activity moving forward on the site and that sort of thing. So in terms of interested community members, if we can be helpful with that, we're happy to do that.
Okay.
And I think we'll be proactively doing that on our own too. So if there's I know Cheryl's been working with you, Jay, and there's a point person that's best for us to work with on that, it'd be helpful for us moving forward.
Right. And just bringing up, I know, one of the issues is sometimes the communication misses people. And so we're all kind of scrambling around trying to inform everybody else. So, I just want to point out that, the state of New Hampshire hasn't been on a lot of communications lately. We need to include them just as an important stakeholder as everybody else. Right. And I like to keep Kelsey informed of any community involvement actions, just to keep pace because she is the contact for that.
Yeah, and I would like to any communications should come to the town, and then we can have, the town manager give us the update so we can disseminate it to the rest of everyone else. And the same with the BD group, like all communications that come through the town in that manner. I know sometimes I'll have a call from Mike or I'll have a call from you, and I just want to make sure that we're all in the loop together and all the information is coming to everyone the same. So, sorry. Didn't mean that. But I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming in tonight. And it was a very informative and great presentation. So we'll make sure we get this up on our webpage to share with our residents, and we'll get it out in an email blast and do that and post it to our webpage and social media. So.
Great. The only thing I noticed is not on there is any contact information, which I didn't think of, but if you'd like to add that before you post it, I could shoot either mine or Aaron's over to you.
If you get it over to Beth, and we can get it up on the webpage as well.
That way you don't have to answer some of these questions.
They have multiple presentations up.
Yes.
Yes.
That's good.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I just put that. I did mine.
I don't know. We could ask them, send them an email, or we could ask them right now.
Hi, I just wanted to say Kelsey got
Yes,
all
it
these
would be a state.
I don't think I have any cards on me tonight, but I will. She's got my info. We got, yeah, that's
That's Kelsey.
figured out how to communicate.
Kelsey, let's get a question for you.
I don't think there is fracking in New Hampshire.
Okay.
I can ask them.
Just check it, because if it was, it would be something that we wouldn't want in that area.
In these, well,
No, I mean, in the residential
yeah.
in the area. I just didn't know if that's something that, because I know other states do allow that.
Let me ask them really quickly. I don't think,
Fracking.
I don't think so.
All right, so moving on to our next portion of the agenda. Do you have anything? No. Okay. Thank you. Hold on one moment.
Thank you.
Thank you all. All right, next on the agenda, we have our health officer, Pat Kiley, to talk to us about the adoption of New Hampshire rules for sanitary products and distribution, HEP 2300.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Welcome.
So this is going to be a very informative line-by-line read of this entire regulation.
That's what I was hoping for.
That's what we're excited about.
I know that I clocked their presentation at an hour and 20 minutes. I think I can get it in an hour and 19.
You may be here by yourself.
Yeah.
He's an overachiever.
In the interest of everyone's time, Beth, did everybody get the cover email that I sent? Okay. So, I mean, this really sums it up. So, at the top of Chapter 81 of the Code of the Town of Plaistow, it notes that the Town of Plaistow will adopt the New Hampshire State Rules, HEP 2300, which regulates food service businesses and food preparation service overall. And that's outlined in the state. This is where we draw all of our regulations, all of regulatory power, all of the categories for food service licensure, as well as any actions that we can take for food service establishments that violate any of the sections of the Code of the Town of Plaistow or the HEP. And it all comes out of RSA 147. So the top says that we felt that although it's listed in the top there that we're always going to accept the most recent version, it's been a little bit since it's been accepted. We're currently operating under 2017 and previous revisions of these rules. If you take a read through, everything is 2019 or greater is the most current version of these regulations. So we did want to bring this before the board as the Board of Health and the Board of Selectmen to recommend that we adopt the most recent versions of all of the rules except for HEP 3202. HEP 3202 says that the state is going to regulate food businesses, although in New Hampshire, there is an exemption for self-inspecting towns and cities. We are one of those, so we do not accept HEP 3202 as part of this package. Essentially, if you want me to go through the major changes, and then I'll take questions. The major changes are to specifications within the classes of food licensure, where they're now more specific than they were previously. More specific, not meaning more restrictive, just more descriptive of what actually is being done in the business. Right now, you have category A through G, and it's only one catch-all for each category. Now you get into A1, A2, and so on, descriptive of what the business is actually doing to get a better, so that anybody who's researching a license can look at a license, has a better understanding of what the business is actually licensed to do. And that's one of the major changes, is making sure that businesses are operating under the appropriate class of license that they have been granted based on risk-based analysis for these licenses as well. Higher volume food processors, for example, are higher risk than a smaller 1 to 25 seat restaurant, as the contamination, if there was to be a foodborne illness outbreak, is far greater for a food processor that's generating 1 million units of food a year for distribution, as opposed to a smaller food service operation that would be local to the town. Happy to answer any and all questions that you have. I think that's the broad overview of what we're trying to accomplish here.
I guess I have only one question, and that is would it make sense to adopt this globally forever, except for the changes that pertain to town licensure, so that we're always up to date without having to come back in here and do that?
So the way that it's written in the code of the town is what's in the body of this email, that the town, with exception of 3202, will adopt all future amendments and revisions to HCP 2300. We felt that we didn't want to just, the Board of Selectmen are also the Board of Health, so you have a vested interest in this. We wanted to make sure that you understood we have had several years since we've updated this. So I would say it would be up to, that's not a decision that I would make, but it would be up to the board to decide if that's appropriate.
I know that I just read through it briefly, it's something that I have no knowledge of, all the updates, or do I care to have a knowledge of it? As long as I know that where I'm going into, the food isn't going to give me ptomaine, then I'm okay, But I would, I don't know how many changes or updates there are in the course of a year from the state, but I would want us to always be current, not just with the current, but with anything that came up in the interim. So that's my only question to the board. Should we adopt it universally as it comes out, with the exception of the P2300?
We could do that.
Yeah, and that probably does make sense.
I don't see why not. And then it's something that could, if in the future we change it to a state inspection, that could be changed in the future. So I think going ahead with that, with your suggestion, would work. So,
and we're happy to, as changes come into effect in this document, provide updates to the board, either at a public meeting or via email, or written to notify you all of the changes.
That would be the only requirement, just so we know.
Are these updated happening annually or throughout the year? And what type of a burden does that put on food establishments if you're going to be changing the game along the way? Shouldn't we do this once a year instead of
Review it annually?
Right. That way, the establishments have an opportunity to come to compliance as the rates are changed throughout the year, instead of changing them along the way each and every time.
Well, do the restaurants and the food service places get these regulation changes also?
The answer is maybe.
Okay.
We do education anytime that we go out to an inspection. If there's been a change, an update, we'll provide that education to the food service business and help guide them in that process. I would say that the state of New Hampshire has in the past updated more than once a year. However, they have also taken some years and not updated anything at all. 2022, I do not believe that there were any changes to the food code. 2019, they updated it twice, but they did a large deal of updating to the food code in 2019, which is what we should be operating on right now. So the majority of, when you look down through all the dates where they provide final updates, the majority of them occur once a year.
Right.
And generally it's in the late summer to early fall when those change. So I think that unless there is a major change, which would be broadcast out through the health officer network, and the state would make us very aware that they were making a significant change, the annual review in January or similar time of year would be appropriate to look at that. Yes.
Are there any
I would say, I think that makes sense, right? Annually, it's once a year.
Right, nothing happens, nothing changes, but,
Right.
and then at least we're made aware of it. Our businesses that we support are made aware of it, because as he stated, they're not always gonna be on top of this stuff. They're busy running their businesses, and understandably so.
I mean, you said most of the changes come out usually by January?
Looking at past updates that they've done to these regulations, usually they are publishing them late summer or early fall.
So I guess it'll be a matter of when would you want that annual month to be?
Or when are your annual inspections?
Annual inspections aren't all, we do them all throughout the year. So I would say that we have currently 56 food service businesses in town. Coming this year, anticipating adding an additional 5 to 10 businesses. It's looking really good growth-wise right now. We have 3 businesses that are looking to do plan review before April. So generally, that's broken up across the 12 months, and we do 2 inspections per year per food service business, one being the annual inspection, which is scheduled, the other being an unscheduled inspection at another point during the year.
Would you have a month that you would think would be the best to do it annually by?
January. I think that January currently has a very low number of licenses that are in the month of January. I would say January is the best time to do that.
Are our licenses a pass-fail situation? Or is it graded like in Massachusetts where you're at A, a B, a C, or D, and I don't want to eat there?
Right. So, we have a green, yellow, red system.
Okay.
Green being you pass, you have no problems. Yellow being we found some issues. We're going to work with you to correct them. You can remain open as long as you follow the guidelines provided. And then we have red, which means you must cease operations immediately. So it's not quite a pass-fail. There's opportunities to correct violations on site and have that marked. There's opportunities to correct within a certain period of time, and it goes down from there into ordering a business to correct certain items in a defined period of time. That usually occurs post-incident, so a fire incident, a flooding incident, where in order to protect the public, we'll suspend a license, order a remediation steps to be taken, and then those businesses are then re-inspected, and as long as they meet the criteria that was put forth in the order, those businesses are then, the licenses are immediately, the suspension is lifted and they are allowed to do business again.
And just one question I had, if we adopt this now, does this affect anyone's current license, or is it their grandfathered in until they
So, yep,
there's really nothing significant in here that would change someone's license currently.
No. We would change license types. The application form would change for licenses starting in April. The March application submission were already sent out to the businesses.
Okay. All right. Let's see. So any other questions on this? We do have a draft motion, but it talks about all future amendments and revisions. Do we want to,
An annual review in January.
yeah,
Yeah,
do that?
say our first meeting in January or
Yeah,
second
just
or whatever.
cut out all future, add in an annual review in January.
Motion.
Sounds good.
All right, so I'll take a motion to adopt HEP 2300 rules for our health department.
Yeah, do it. You go ahead and do it.
All right, I'll make the motion. I'll motion to adopt the most current version of the New Hampshire rules for sanitary production and distribution of food, HEP 2300, with the exception of HEP 3202 in accordance with RSA 141,
147.
147.
140,
147.
147, colon 1, sorry. I don't know why I said that. Town also. And then the town of Plaistow also adopts an annual review and of amendments and revisions to the state of New Hampshire's rules for sanitary production and distribution of food, HEP 2330.
I'll second it.
Second by Darrell. Any further discussion?
I just add the verbiage in January.
Yes. All. Yeah, we'll add in January. Yep.
The annual January review.
Annual January review. Okay. All right. Any further discussion? All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries 400. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Doing a great job.
Thank you.
Keep it up. All right. Next on the agenda, we had Davis Park parking. We had some late information come in. I don't think a lot of us had the time to review it, so we're going to table it for our next meeting, which would probably be, the 27th? Because 2 weeks from now is a holiday. President's Day, we're not going to have a meeting.
Correct.
The 20th?
The 20th, town hall is closed.
So,
George Washington's birthday. They took that away from him.
we'll meet we'll push that out to the 27th. And then next up, we have review of and approve of corrected minutes from the meeting from 1/3/23. Let's see. So in that,
Where are we?
On page 2 is the correct.
yeah, on page 2, it had to do with the citizens petition that we read into the record. The sentence wasn't in the right place, so we just wanted to amend the minutes to fix that. It's on page 2, highlighted in yellow. So I'll take a motion to approve, to correct the minutes of 1/3/23.
I'll make the motion.
Motion by Bill, second by Darrell. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
400. All right. And then next up, we have approve. Is there anything else around minutes, Beth?
I'm sorry.
Was there anything else around minutes that we needed to correct
Yeah.
while we're here?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry.
The rest are on the
The,
consent agenda.
the minutes for February 4th following deliberative were not on the consent agenda,
Okay.
but they're pretty brief, so I thought maybe we could approve them tonight.
Yeah, so after deliberative session, we had a quick meeting to approve some of the changes that occurred at deliberative session. And we have the minutes for that meeting. It was a record, like 4 or 5 minutes meeting after deliberative. So I just want to make sure. We just revoted a couple warrant articles, so I'll take a motion to approve the February 4th, 2023 meeting minutes.
Motion made.
Motion by Darrell, second by John Gifford. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries 400. All right, next up, we have approved Carly's Way as a town road. So typically, when there's developments in town that have a road, eventually the town will take ownership of that road after certain criteria is met. I believe D. Voss had provided us a memo with that they've achieved some of the criteria for that punch list, and we just need to approve it. So, Mr. Colby, anything you want to add to that?
Nope. I mean, everything is laid out there with a memo.
Right.
Page 2 of the memo does have a draft motion.
I move to accept the road known as Carly's Way and described in the deed submitted by Christina M. Kelly, trustee of the Hoyt Realty Trust, May 1st, 2000, as the town Plaistow public right-of-way with the following conditions. The performance bond in the amount of $45,200 shall be posted for the benefit of the town of Plaistow for a term of 2 years at the discretion of the Board of Selectmen, satisfactory legal review of the proposed right-of-way deed.
Okay, motion by Darrell. Can I get a second?
Second.
Second by John Gifford. Any further discussion? All right, welcome to the town, Carly's Way, I guess.
So everyone knows where it is. It's the road right up behind Park.
Yes. Yep. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries 400. All right, next up, we have the consent agenda. We had, in the consent agenda, we had the February 2nd and February 9th manifest. We have the Board of Selectmen draft minutes from the 23rd of January. We have 3 administrative abatement requests, 1 BTLA Board of Tax and Land Appeal mediation abatement, and then 3 deeds for burial plots. So I'll take a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Motion made.
Motion by Darrell, second. I'll second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries. All right. Town Manager's Report, Mr. Colby.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good evening.
Busy with plenty, as everybody knows, with deliberative, which I felt went very well. And, want to thank everybody that turned out, department heads and the like, that were responsible for, the process, helping set up, but then also going all the way back to August with, the budget and the like. Have been busy finalizing some other things, such as a GASB 75 report, which is part of the audit. It's a biannual review that is required. Other updates, the interview for the police chief will be conducted later this month. I sent emails out. We've got a panel assembled, a couple of selectmen, school administrators and the like, as long as a couple of town employees. So that will be in the middle of the month. Also, over the last couple of weeks,
How many candidates do we have at this point?
I believe we're interviewing 5.
5.
I think that is the case.
And that was, we originally had 5 or more?
No, it was 12 to 14, I believe. I don't have all the specifics. We had, the outside company that had done the initial advertising, cutting down, resume review, phone interviews, essay questions, and then they have whittled it down to, I think it's 4 or 5 candidates that we will be reviewing and interviewing.
Okay.
So I'll get packets of information out to those that have, are going to be on the panel to review ahead of time, the resumes, the essay questions, and the like.
Okay.
So,
excellent. Thank you.
in addition, police department matters. We were also notified by town council that the matter with the former police chief is still continuing. There has been a change in his counsel. So we got that notification. as well. Water,
Excuse me, he has another new counsel?
yes.
Okay.
So there was motion filed by his former counsel with the courts that is disassociating with him, so.
Oh, okay.
On the waterfront, where still D is working with the software company and the like, where we were hoping to get bills out, obviously, for the final quarter of last year, but we keep running into some issues. Issues with the meters are all good, but the sensors that transmit the information upon install, we have some zero reads. So we're working through that. We're hoping to get bills out as soon as possible. I have had a couple of phone calls from, businesses and people looking for their water bills, obviously, don't want to miss something. So those are also going out. The other thing I want to bring, I had a meeting today with the state, with our engineers and our operator. There will be a notice that's going to go out to the users of the system whenever there is a violation, an exceedance in certain areas, which unfortunately we do have an exceedant, and we need to send out a notice about that. And it basically has to do what's called, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but HAA5, which is a acid within the water. It's nothing that is of an immediate concern. As the state puts it, if somebody were to drink this water over many, many years, they have an increased risk of getting cancer. So it's...
Was that water from the reservoir?
Well, it is, but as you know, it goes through several systems along the way. And what it is in the breakdown of the, trying to think of the word, like the chlorination, you get some organic, it mixes with organic matters and can form acids. So that's what's happening.
Flush itself out.
Yep. So very soon after the first round of testing disclosed this, we took immediate steps to do additional flushing, do additional cleaning of the tank to rid everything of excess organic matter. So we did a second round of tests, which lowered the amount of acid tremendously. The problem is that the town of Salem is experiencing their own minor issues. So the water that's coming from Salem may be at a slightly elevated, although it still is below levels, it's coming in at an elevated rate through Hawk to us. So even though ours water within the system went down significantly, because the water coming in was slightly elevated, we're still at an elevated. Salem is changing they were doing what was called a chlorine burn to try to fix things. But by the end of February, they're going back to their chloranamine disinfection process. So we're anticipating that the incoming levels will drop so that we will see much better.
All levels were pretty good till it got to Salem?
I don't know for sure, but I know Salem is where I'm assuming, yes, I can't say for sure, but Salem is experiencing those problems and they're tackling their disinfection a little bit
I was just thinking that's how you pinpoint it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly would hope that you'd be taking a sample from the head end of the pump and within our system so that we can decide whether the issue is in Plaistow or it's north of it.
And that's what is done. That's why I can say that we know that the levels within Plaistow, so the the steps that we took immediately paid off dividends. The unfortunate part is because, now we're dealing with a higher level coming in. Even those steps brought it down, but not down enough because of.
I didn't realize, I'll be honest with you guys, I didn't realize it was coming through. I thought Salem was using Canopy Lake Park. Canopy Lake is their reservoir. They always did.
They always did, but they're having problems with that. So they are part of the Southern New Hampshire Interconnect. So they are getting water from Manchester as well.
Okay.
So to help supplement, I think, what they've got going on. So that letter will be going out this week. But again, it's not, not an emergency. If it had been, we would have, made the notification immediately. But steps have already been taken to address this. We've seen improvement with those steps. As time goes on, we, hope to continue that. And once Salem makes that disinfection change at the end of February, the hope is everything will be back to normal.
Okay.
Other than that,
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Colby. Let's see. Town managers reports. Mr. Gifford.
Selectmen's report?
they selected.
Oh, sorry. Selectmen's report.
You've been promoted.
Hey, if you want.
No,
Good job. Town manager job.
You've almost had a year. It's time to move on up.
actually, I haven't had any meetings outside of just gatherings that we've all enjoyed together. So I don't have anything. I have rec coming up
Okay.
this Wednesday. So I'll have something for us on the next gathering.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Britton?
No, I have nothing. The budget is done, so that's a good thing.
All right. Mr. Coy?
Yeah, we had Old Home Day meeting. Now that the holidays are over, they're gearing back up again for everything. So we should start seeing some more information come out on that. The date for that is June 17th on Saturday. So we do know that. And they're even already starting to talk about Old Home Day the following year, because that'll be the town's 275th anniversary. So they're already talking about that. Attended a planning board meeting. The results of the survey are in. Those should start to get posted probably at some point, I'd say in the next few weeks. But it was pretty good. The survey had over 250 results.
That's great.
Which was pretty good. You never know what you're going to get.
Right.
So that was good. Saturday, I know a few of us, we went to musical bingo, first time, which was a good event. Plastow Rec up at the fishing game. It seemed like it was very successful. I couldn't believe how packed it was.
Yeah.
For a cold night.
Yeah.
Absolute success.
And I think half the crowd seemed they were over at Plastow Pizza Company ahead of time.
All right. Thanks, Bill. I was at deliberative session, and for me, it was like a record 3.5 hour. I haven't been in a deliberative session that short in a long time. So, but it went well, and people commented. There was good discussion. So, just want to thank the town employees for all they did for organizing it, getting it all set up and ready for us. And I would call it a success. So, thank you, everyone. And I think that's it. I don't have any events coming up. Any other business anyone wants to discuss?
Just one thing, and just a question. We have 2 people on the committee for the chiefs from the school system, and I've never encountered that before. Is there a reason why the school system is being brought in to our chief?
It was recommended by MRI.
Okay.
To get kind of the stakeholders and where they do interact with the police department, especially more so nowadays. And also having a school resource officer over there that, in order to establish a good line of communication, That's what the recommendation was.
Okey doke. Anything else? Nothing else? All right, do we need anything for non-public? No? All right, I'll adjourn the meeting at 7:54. Good night, everyone.